Welcome to the Rational Egoist. I'm your host, Michael Liebowitz. As you can see, with us once again is the great James Stevens Valliant. He's a regular on the show, and he's usually here to talk to us about philosophers, economists, various topics. But today I got him here to talk about one thing, and that is himself. And as much as he may not want to, I told him I really don't care what he wants. This is my show, and we're just going to talk about him, and he's going to have to deal with it. Jim,
I,
welcome back.
welcome, thank you. I obey orders if you insist.
Well,
People like that old joke. People say I'm way too obsessed with myself. But enough about them.
yes, yes, yes. And we have, I think, both been accused of being Israeli intelligence. So the idea of you
Oh
taking
yeah.
orders might be wise.
Well, you're my Mossad, contact.
Handler, yes.
So, right. I know you got the code, so I obey the instructions from Mossad. It's true. I have to admit it.
So, Jim, I got to say, you have lived a very interesting life. And, you've got the objectivist thing going on here. That's, I think, probably what you're most known for. But you've also got the religious historian going on, as people can see from Creating Christ. You also were a prosecutor for many years. And of course, you're well versed in libertarian philosophy, which I think is vital if you're really going to understand the ideas of freedom. There were so many people that weren't objectivists that contributed to the idea of liberty. And the fact that you are so well versed in them, I think is phenomenal. So we're going to get to all of that. But the first thing I want to
Can I just
ask
say
you,
right there,
say,
recently you've done things on Hayek and Friedman, and if objectivists give you grief for that, I want to do the pushback on those objectivists.
okay,
Because as flawed, and everyone knows that Ayn Rand was a critic of those guys, and for good reason. I mean, it's the defenders of a good idea who are more responsible if that good idea doesn't get through, really, than the attackers. So she's really got a point, and we've on our side have got to make sure we're doing. But it's not like you're denying. You're not like you're saying I reject objectivism in the face of Humean, Hayekian epistemology. You're exploring and
right.
as I said when we discussed Hayek, there are many valuable things that he says. Well, I just wanted to get that out of the way.
Well,
All you objectivists out there, stop giving him grief. There's value to be found in both Friedman and Hayek for all of their errors, so long as we, as objectivists, know what those errors are. So,
and I think to go along with that, and I have no way to know who has done this and who hasn't, but it's important that we learn that those are errors for ourselves and not just repeat what Ayn Rand said. For one thing, that she would be disgusted at that idea of her just being parroted. But also, there's an assumption there that she couldn't be wrong. And of course, she was wrong. And she acknowledged that people are not omniscient. We're not fallible. I mean, we're not infallible. We're capable of errors. And that obviously applies to herself as well.
in
So,
fact, Ayn Rand, in her own notes to herself, admitted making mistakes. Ayn Rand, and out loud even said she made mistakes. If Ayn Rand could admit she makes mistakes, and if Ayn Rand said we're all, none of us are omniscient or infallible, I think we should take that seriously if we're objectivists. Yes.
absolutely. All right, Jim. So you grew up and education was emphasized in your life from the beginning. I mean, can you tell us a little bit about your early home life and how your dad, I mean, you've told me how your dad taught you science, and it's phenomenal. And I think our listeners here would love to hear it.
Well, I was very, very fortunate. The choice we never make that's the most important in terms of outcomes is who our parents are sometimes. I am astonished at people like you, for example, who, but I've used you as an example a lot. But as everyone knows, people like John D. Rockefeller and Henry Ford and Thomas Edison, they came from poverty. They came from disadvantaged backgrounds. Whatever you think of Abraham Lincoln, he taught himself how to read practically in a log cabin, having been born to illiterates in the frontier. And he gave himself a classical education. I love stories of people who do that. And unfortunately, I cannot say that I had. I think that a lot of posts you've made recently about how tough times make us stronger and give us resistance. I had an idyllic childhood. I had the best parents you can possibly imagine. My dad is a brilliant computer engineer and scientist with dozens of patents under his belt. Back in the 1960s, 70s, 80s, 90s, he was developing high-tech equipment that today we sort of take for granted in especially our large industrial computer systems, testing equipment, things like that. He helped develop cameras for Skylab. He was just a genius guy. He is the classic American businessman as Ayn Rand defines it. He did teach me science and math. And, you know, he was the kind of guy who, as a little boy, I wanted to be and copy and look up to. He gave me that sense of security, you know, took us on camping trips every year, took me to ball games. He had me in the garage working on cars, teaching me mechanics. From the time I was just a little kid, I had just a wonderful, wonderful dad. When he wasn't working his ass off because he was a workaholic, he was devoting every single spare second to his kids. He was a remarkable guy that way, and a brilliant math teacher. He could, without even you noticing it, get you to understand aspects of math. Before I even realized it, I was doing algebra. Before I even realized it, he was telling me, he was, you know, we were playing with, and that's the way he'd do it. He'd play like shapes. Or we'd consider problems, and he could develop a relationship. And it's crazy as hell to say it, but he would later tell me that, oh, well, that relationship we call a tangent, that relationship we call a cosine. And before I even knew what the word trigonometry meant, he's explaining to me the concepts of trigonometry as a small kid. So as a kid, he was very involved in our education. He very much wanted us to have good education. Super smart guy. His mom, super smart too. Brilliant. My grandmother, just woo. And so he and my father's family very much emphasized learning, getting university education, taking ideas seriously in one sense. But he would have loved nothing more than for one of his sons to be an engineer or a scientist. Like Ayn Rand says, you know, he was the virtues, but he was also sort of the blind spots. When I explained to him, see, to me, math came natural. By the time I was, what, 12, I was starting to do differential equations in calculus without even knowing that's what I was doing. At 13, 14, I'm there in school. Oh, yeah. And the math teacher's like, who taught you how to do that? I said, well, my dad. My dad said, how would you, okay, Jimmy, how would we go about measuring this irregular surface or this non-constant motion, wiggly motion? How would we go about figuring that out? And he could literally, I could ask Dad, why is the sky blue? And when I was a little kid, and
This
he
is
would,
one of my favorite stories. Let me just put that out there right now. I love this story.
oh, I love it too, because my dad was this way. He would say, well, I want you to think about that now, Jimmy. I will answer your question, but I'm not going to answer your question till sunset. It's nice. He looked around, he looked at the sky, nice clear blue sky up above, and he looked around to make sure that we'd have a sunset. And he, actually, I think on that day he could see even some clouds gathering in the west, so it would be a particularly good one. So he's like, "Oh yeah, yes." So at sunset, ask me that question now. Between now and sunset, I want you to think about it. And the only clue I'm going to give you is that it's sunset where you can see what I mean exactly right. And so I thought about, well, how is sunset going to make a difference? And I think, well, what happens? And I began to actually start a little bit thinking about the atmosphere and what the atmosphere will do to sunlight. And of course, by that sunset, Dad had the absolute, we could see the different colors, the yellow, the orange, the red, as the sun is setting slowly in the west. And he could explain that the atmosphere is like a prism. And it refracts light, just like white light comes in and different lights come out. So it is that the way the sunlight is hitting the Earth's atmosphere will create the colors that we see in the sky. Huh. And you could ask Dad, how does a refrigerator work? Dad, energy goes in, but how is it that keeps it frozen or cold inside the refrigerator? And he was, well, there again, I want you to think. But by the time he had me thinking it through, and that was the phrase my dad is the iconic phrase from my childhood. The phrase he used 10 times more often than any other phrase. Think it through. Think it through. Wait, Jimmy. Think it through. You really want to think that through. He was a capitalist in his soul. he believed in the morality of individualist capitalism, and there's no other way of putting it. He saw individual virtue in terms of how well a man does his work, or how well a woman does his work. He never was a sexist, but how well that to him that mattered, and he could tell the difference between the output and the creative thought that went into it. And so, if I wanted something as a kid, I said, God, I really want that. That would be really cool to have, Dad. He would say, well, then what are you going to do to get it? How are you going to effectuate causally the process? What work do you intend to do? What plan do you have? Because you need to do some thinking and working if you intend to get this thing. And
Jim, I just
talk
gotta
about
say,
virtue, right?
hold on, don't spoil my big moment here. Recently, we actually did an episode about the objectivist virtues, and what you described just now is the intellectual and existential virtue of independence, right? Think for yourself, earn for yourself. So even, I mean, at a young age, and your father was not an objectivist. So he's just kind of, and I think I want to
In
hone
fact,
in on that for a second.
in fact, yeah, I want to hone in on that too. I was saying that he was very much like the American businessman that Ayn Rand described, because when I see, I think it is an important, he encouraged independence to such a point that his children each declared their own intellectual independence from him. He was such a power, both he and my mother were such powerful influences on us. And it is a necessary part of maturation that you get yourself a sense of independence from your parents, and that sort of psychological declaration of independence that we all need to do in our youth from our parents. It meant that my brother and I in particular, although Dad loved us, and he would have loved nothing more than for one of his sons to become an engineer or a computer scientist, a businessman, make something, do something practical, make money, be a businessman, build something. Dad would say, I say, I'm going to go study. I'm going to go to university. What are you going to study? Philosophy and history. The look on his face was one of grave disappointment. And the words that he used, if I may use it on your podcast, you're really going to study that bullshit? And so you see how Ayn Rand is right, how America's best minds, how America's best people, they're businessmen like my dad, who really do exemplify all that is virtuous about the old American sense of life, really. How they abandoned philosophy to the worst and left the worst elements in control of our humanities and social science departments. And it's a funny thing, I discover objectivism and I explain it to my family, and my entire family, my mother, my father, my brother, my sister, they're all basically converted to objective. They all start reading Ayn Rand. They all start nodding their eye. This is what this, yes, of course. You know, initially they had taken me to church. They were both raised Christian Protestant backgrounds. My dad, his mother was always an agnostic. She had a degree in comparative religion, and from Stanford Phi Beta Kappa, and she's a really smart lady. And she never really bought religion. She'd studied it too much. Well, it was all kind of BS. But she herself brought her kids up in effect with Christian morality, and my dad knew no other way to teach his kids morality. And that's exactly the weakness you see, Dad, leaving philosophy to those, to calling it bullshit. What you're doing is you're leaving your kids to be educated by these medieval mystics. So he took his kids to church, and I got into it, more religious than my parents were. My mom was one of these ecumenical.
Okay, don't go. Hold on one second. We're gonna, because I want to get to your religiosity in a minute. But it's interesting because I was actually going to make the opposite point, and although it's opposite, I don't think I disagree with you. Where you focused on the fact that your father was an example of the businessmen who turned philosophy over to the scoundrels, I was thinking of it in terms of your father was a person, in evidence of somebody who could live a rational moral life without studying philosophy. But I
Yes.
think that both are true, because while he may have on an individual level lived a moral life and was rational and taught his children to be rational, he didn't see the need to make it explicit so that it could, and not that he could have done it on his own, but if every businessman or the majority of them focused on making it explicit, then it can inundate the culture. And that's where the type of businessman like your father sort of fails. But at the same time, it's like, does he owe the culture? Does he owe anybody except for himself and his own family? And I would have to say no.
Of
It's
course not.
it may be unfortunate, but if everybody just did what your father did, what a better world it would
What
be.
a better world.
It would be,
Oh
you know
my
what I mean?
God. Oh my God. My dad is a man of high character, sterling integrity. I mean, he is the embodiment, without knowing it, he was the embodiment of so much of objectivist ethics, honesty, justice, integrity, productiveness. He was the most hardworking, rights respecting, peace loving, but don't mess with him because he was really hardcore about self defense. If someone threatens you, you will fight back when you can win and win. Make sure you win. You know, he's the kind of guy, don't point a gun unless you mean to fire it, but there's a reason for guns. So he had a very clear cut morality and he had a moral sense and a moral sense that was independent. He asked, where does that come from? He didn't know where it came from. And he understood later, as I explained objectivism to him, suddenly his appreciation for morality. So it wasn't a vice on his part that he didn't get philosophy. It's just that the substance of what, as I say, his mother was well educated in philosophy, and she could sort of adumbrate to him the horrors of it as he was growing up. And that's sort of what drove him into engineering and being a businessman, frankly, as opposed to anything like what mom studied, his mom studied.
Yeah.
But when he was presented with objectivism, he embraced it. He embraced it without hesitation, and all the way down. It's atheism, it's reason, it's egoism, and in terms of politics, go, oh well, finally something makes sense. Both free speech and free private property. That he told. My parents were wonderful in the sense that they had very liberal social values. Very liberal social values. They were hippies from the 60s, basically. They went and saw Hair in the original cast performance of Hair back in the late 60s when it was happening. Uh, they were that 60s couple who were having kids, but who were, you know, could look at Woodstock and say, well, we wouldn't be there because we wouldn't endanger our kids to be there, but peace, love, you know. And I was raised with the idea that Martin Luther King, see, dad was like a Goldwater Republican, mom was like a Kennedy Democrat, and but they both agreed that Martin Luther King was doing good, and it was hammered into me that racism was just savage evil, and you don't judge people based on the characteristics they're born with. You treat all people with respect. You give them the benefit of the doubt. They have the same rights as you. Everyone's equal. And my sister, you can do anything you want. My sister, of course, she's getting lectured her whole childhood that she could do it. She could be a brain surgeon. She could be a NASA engineer. She could, and her dad's literally encouraging her to do things like that. And she says, no, I just want to be a mom. She's got 5 kids, grandkids. Now, she approached it scientifically. You know, she really did. She's a rational
Well,
mom and grandma.
yeah.
But
Have you ever seen the movie? I think it's called, I believe it's Mona Lisa Smile, I think is the name of the movie. And there's an interesting scene where Julia Roberts was the teacher. I hope I'm getting the movie right. Otherwise, I may
I
throw
don't think
some
I've
people
seen
off.
it, no.
But anyway, she was a feminist, and she was teaching the girls at her school that they could do whatever they want. And then one girl decided to be a mother, and Julia Roberts got upset with her. Oh, there's so much you can do, and the girl said, "Well, hold on, this is what I want to do." So, isn't it about having the choice?
A choice.
Yeah. But your
And
dad, Jim,
that's it.
what you said about your dad, he reminds me similarly to a Hank Reardon prior to Francisco explaining things to him. And that's what it sounds like you
Without the
explaining
sex
to your
guilt.
dad without the
Without
sex
the sex
guilt.
guilt.
Yeah. That's why I said almost,
Dad was very much like Hank Reardon without
except
the
the
sex.
sex guilt,
That's
sans
exactly
sex
it.
guilt.
But it was wonderful how Ayn Rand uses both the economics guilt that's used on the most productive people to guilt them, to guilt trip them, like Hank Reardon's family and the world at large. And but he also does it with sex, and that's just amazing. My dad wasn't that bad off. My dad actually had a very positive view and a very healthy view about. That's another thing we were raised with liberal social values. My brother comes out of the closet as a teenager gay, does not phase my parents one little. Wonderful, great, and they totally embrace that. And as I say, my dad was, in terms of economic matters and in terms of foreign policy matters, he's like a Goldwater conservative. But when it came to social, and my mom sort of deferred to him on all those kind of things. So it was a kind of a good background because mom was the one sort of providing the, oh, but you've got to be good to everyone and love everyone. And she emphasized those social values, but both my parents agreed with them. And so what it ended up being was a very, very positive environment for kids to be raised in. I have to tell you, it was, how could I have imagined better parents? I mean, it's really, I am as lucky as anyone could possibly have been. So if I screw up, it's all my fault. I don't have any context that I can blame for it. On the other hand, because they gave me this foundation, like I say, I was able to declare my independence. They gave me the secure uh, what's the attachment. That's the word psychologists use. They gave me such secure attachment that I could argue with my parents. They, from the earliest I can remember, around the dinner table, encouraged us to talk politics, current events, philosophy, religion, you name it. Everything that was going on in the late 60s and 1970s, which was a lot, socially speaking, everything that was going on, we can talk about. And even as we were kids, we could participate, and we were encouraged to participate in the conversations. But they would be very, let me put it this way, matter of fact about their own evaluation of our opinions. My dad or my mom would say, well, you're not taking into account this basic fact, or have you heard about that? Oh, yeah, you're right, Mom. I hadn't thought about that. Or, Dad, you're right. I hadn't thought about that. And so they would not be shy about criticizing your opinion. And so you better come to the table with and if you do speak up, and that encouraged me very much in the way, you can see the way I am about ideas and communication. If it weren't for that environment with my wonderful parents, my wonderful grandparents, that I don't think I could be what I am today. On the other hand, as I say, I get the credit and I can distinguish because they gave me that secure attachment to go off and do things that I knew my parents would never have dreamed of doing. And I was doing something that I knew Dad thought was at first bullshit. And then I'm getting into it. And then as I come back to him, I could answer his questions. And Dad is really smart. And I had to answer pretty rigorous questions from him all along. And I would anticipate questions, and that he really liked too. And then you see how philosophers would say this, but this is our answer. And he suddenly got the value of philosophy and history and knew its importance and knew that Ayn Rand was right, that philosophy was the key and the problem and what America had so desperately needed. So it was nothing, I wouldn't say it was any vice on his part, but it's just the way America is. Unfortunately, people have got that bad taste in their mouth from philosophy, from the awful substance that
From the
philosophy
bastards.
is. Yeah.
Yeah, we can use foul language here. It's okay.
Okay.
Okay. So you alluded to your religiosity. So I want to know a couple things. First of all, how old were you when you really got into it? What led you into it? And then what freed you from it?
Well, they took us to church just from, like I was going to say about my mom. My mom was one of these classic California ecumenical, all religions say the sort of the same thing. I've told the story. My parents set up their first house together, and my mom puts a statue of Buddha, a picture of Jesus, and a photograph of my dad on the same table.
Sounds like a joke. Right? You
It's,
have a picture of Jesus, a
does
Buddha, and a statue
no,
of Dad, and here you go.
literally, my mom in the first home that my parents had, my dad comes home from work that very first night. My parents tell the story. They report the story. There's Buddha, the statue of Buddha, the portrait of Jesus, and the photo of my dad on the same surface. My dad says, "Honey, you can choose, but there can only be one God in this house." As the family legend goes, it was only the photograph of my dad that remained.
All
But my
right.
dad, but my mom was of the opinion. I remember as a kid, all religions basically get at the same thing, the same fundamental truth. There's something out there. There is some purpose to life. They're all just sort of kind of saying the same thing. Be good to each other. That kind of a thing. Very sloppy thinking, I know, but it conveyed her benevolence to some extent. Um, if a degree of philosophical imprecision as well. I love my mom, though, and she'll hear this and she'll know exactly what I mean. But when I was taken to church because they wanted to teach us morality, I listened. I took it seriously. They told me this is the metaphysical truth. This is the crucial morality that will save your soul. This is you pay heed, kid. And if this is important, and they declare themselves to be important. And that was the thing. I think I plugged into the importance of philosophy at an early age. I was about 9 years old. when I think I had a very serious, hey, these are ideas. Ideas matter. They're important. They shape everything. Without Ayn Rand, I could see the power of religion shaping things. And unfortunately, though, I embraced Christianity and read the Bible as a kid. I mean, I was a weird kid. I was a really weird kid in terms of the amount I read. I read voluminously and way ahead of my. I was reading stuff. My grandmother, my wonderfully educated grandmother, made sure that we had a copy of, Mortimer Adler's Great Books of the Western World series. I've still got it on my top shelf up there. The same Great Books of the Western World series that Grandma made sure we had. I was the one who got it, of course, because I was poring over that stuff when I was in my preteens, reading stuff way over my head, not grasping it at all, just trying to grasp as much as I can. I get to university and suddenly, well, we're going to be reading Descartes' Meditations. Oh, yeah. Oh, we're only going to be reading that little bit of it? Oh, okay. But the university professors, though, could tell me, oh, did you catch that? Oh, I did not catch that at all. I obviously needed some guidance. I was just diving in and reading philosophical material way over my head. But I was also reading religious material, and I was mostly religious, and was reading all kinds of stuff on the. If at the age of 10 or 11, you'd asked me what I wanted to be before I said lawyer, which I think was about 11, I would have said to you, a clergyman. I would have said you may be a professor of theology or teacher of religion or something, because I was that into religion. Um, uh, what was I? I think I was 12, almost 13. It was the summer I was going to turn 13. Just before that summer, I had a conversion. And it was all that other philosophical stuff I was reading, and other influences like my grandmother, who didn't believe at all, who was always sort of, yeah, it's BS. Um, they weren't terribly religious, but I was religious. And I think it scared my parents how religious I was. And maybe that had an influence on me too, in terms of them doing like a double take on how religious their son is becoming. But I could almost get the impression, and looking back on it, it's clear this is what was going on. My dad was like, "Don't worry, should we tell my mom? Don't worry, Carol. Jimmy will grow out of it. Jimmy's going through a phase. Let Jimmy do his own intellectual journey here." And Dad was sort of right. I mean, Christianity did me damage. Don't get me wrong. I did inculcate certain ideas that I had to really work to get out of my psychology at a later point. But I was about 12, coming on 13, when I had just an overnight conversion. I mean, I went from fundamentalist Christian, the New Testament is the inerrant word of God inspired by the whole 9 yards, to wait a minute here. I was literally praying. I was literally praying. And I had this thing, I'm just talking to myself. I'm really just talking about the things that had been cracks and fissures in the dam had been springing. One of which was, the classic thing. You'll hear this, see the Christians pull up the sign John 3:16 at football games. Well, John 3:16 is famous. For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten son, that whosoever believes in him shall not perish, have eternal life, you see. Well, they read John 3:16, but no one ever gets to John 3:17, John 3:18. But if those don't believe, you are condemned. And I thought to myself, really, should belief be a matter of rewards and punishments? Should God be influencing me to believe in Jesus because I'm going to go to heaven or be punished in hell for eternity? No, belief should be my best judgment. Again, without Ayn Rand, I had this sense that it's wrong to put a gun to my head and say, believe or else, or even a carrot in front of me, a reward in front of me, and say, believe and you'll get this. No, it shouldn't be a matter of rewards and punishments. It should be a matter of my best judgment. And I knew there was some kind of epistemological extortion going on, as they were threatening me with hell if I don't believe. If I don't believe, why should a lack of belief be punished? And then I actually did do the Voltaire and Diderot thing in my own head. If God gave me reason, then surely he expects me to use my reason to the best. The Thomas Jefferson approach, which was very much influenced, by the way, by Voltaire and Diderot. But if God gave me this reason, then surely he expects me to use it, and he can't blame me. In other words, if I do die and meet God one day in heaven, I could look him square in the eye and say, hey, I was going by the best of my reason, Mr. God, and if you have the nerve to send me to hell just because I don't believe what you say I should believe, then go ahead. I don't want to be with you anyway. Send me to hell.
Nice. I believe T.H. Huxley in a debate with Bishop Wilberforce said something similar. They were debating evolution, and Wilberforce said to him, "So, on which side of your family are you descended from, the chimpanzee or something like that?" And Huxley said, "The Lord hath delivered him into my hands." And he basically said the same thing, that, well, I would rather use my God-given reason than just to, believe any old thing. Since I'm talking quotes, I'm on a roll. Thomas Saz, in relation to your talking to yourself, said something to the effect of, "If you're talking to God, you're praying. If God talks to you, you're schizophrenic."
That's the thing.
It was great.
There's a great Woody Allen joke from an old Woody Allen movie. He hears his girlfriend talking, to someone in the room. He gets in the room, the person's gone. Who are you talking to? And she said, "Oh, I was praying." He said, "I heard two voices. I do both parts."
That's nice.
Now that's when you're really psychotic. But if you think about it, religion is sort of institutionalized, permissible psychosis. We can depart from reality. Our cognition doesn't have to reflect reality at all. And we're given permission to be sort of voluntarily psychotic in a certain context.
Not just
Religion.
permission, encouraged. It's
Encouraged.
not just
Yeah.
allowed. It's actually,
As I
this
was
is what
saying,
you should be
threatened if you
doing.
don't.
Yeah, yeah, right. Absolutely. Okay, so at some point you come across the liberty literature. You're introduced to it. At what age? What was it? What was the initial impact? And how did you progress? And I know that's a lot, but you're a
No, well,
smart guy.
now get this. As I explained, Dad, although he's an engineer, very much valued his private property. And when he worked hard or he developed a new device, technological device, he wanted the appropriate reward from it, and he knew he earned it and stuff. This made him, let me put it this way, right of center on economic matters and foreign policy matters. It made him a Goldwater type conservative. And so my dad, well, was a big influence on me in that regard. In the 1970s, William F. Buckley had a TV show on PBS called Firing Line. Milton Friedman did a documentary called Free to Choose on PBS again in the 1970s. Dad very much encouraged me to sit down with him on Sunday evenings to watch William Buckley. But my dad was critical sometimes of Buckley. And it was funny. He wasn't uncritical of it, but boy, what an exposure that gave me to a variety of various thinkers. I mean, I remember in my head when William Buckley interviewed, F.A. Hayek or Thomas Sowell or Milton Friedman, and I remember my dad paying attention, saying, "Oh yes, 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 this is important to pay." So as a little kid, that did put my sympathies, I would say, over in that direction. And before I read Ayn Rand, I could tell you about Milton Friedman. Before I knew Ayn Rand, I would describe. Now I'd already converted to atheism by the time I was 14. Before I'd ever read Ayn Rand, I was an atheist, but I was in the mid and late 1970s. I was for Ronald Reagan under the influence of my dad's political influence, I would say, and say conservative political influence. Let's put it that way. And so I would have described myself to you, say, in 1980 or 1978 or something, as an atheist for Reagan. I knew the tension. I knew Reagan's the one associating with the moral majority. Reagan's the one who's turning the Republicans into a religious thing. And my parents were also, like Ayn Rand, skeptical because another issue they agreed with Ayn Rand on was abortion. They thought that in the early terms, it should be an absolute right. In the early weeks of pregnancy, it should be a woman's absolute right to have an abortion. So they were liberal in that, again, with their social values. And so I had this tension in my head. Like my parents, I was for Martin Luther King and I was for a woman's right to abortion. And yet I knew on economics they were right. And so the way I'd describe it, the best way I would have of describing it was I'm an atheist for Reagan, and I know that's a contradiction. And someone said to me, "You have to read, you young man have to read Ayn Rand." Yeah, I do. And that's what did it. And so, and in fact, it was really funny. I had, in public school, we have what we call social studies, right? And I had a social studies teacher in 8th grade when I was 13. He knew my political proclivities and I was for Reagan. He knew I was an atheist though, too. And so one time when I was reading The Fountainhead at the age of 14, he was teaching a summer school class that I was attending, and he saw me reading The Fountainhead. And he was a liberal. He had this beard and he drove a VW van. And so I nailed him early on saying, "Oh, yeah, you're a hippie liberal. I could tell." I pegged him, and he was disturbed. He goes, "How can you tell?" I said, "Don't worry, it doesn't come through in your teaching, at least not too bad. I can just tell you're a lefty, progressive." And he knew it, he got it. And we sort of had this laughing interaction, very, very positive interaction with me and this teacher, Mr. Holman, my 8th grade social studies teacher. He saw me, though, reading The Fountainhead. I saw the panicked look on his face, absolute panic come across his face. He comes over to my desk, he gets down on his knees, and in very sincere, hushed tones, "You know, this woman's writing can have a powerful effect on intelligent young men such as yourself. And I don't want you, Jim. I want you, Jim, to promise me, these are the exact words. I want you, Jim, to promise me you're not going to get swept up in the emotion and get carried away with the emotion of." He was just afraid I'd get sucked into this Ayn Rand cult. And I promised him, I sincerely, "Mr. Holman, I promise you, I will keep my head on my shoulders. I will question it." But of course, I was swept up with The Fountainhead. The first thing, when I'd first started reading it, I didn't even know it was a woman. That it was a woman. He was in effect the one who told a woman. This reads like it's written by an American man. I relearned that it's a Russian woman, and I'm like, holy moly, this lady is amazing. But I was completely swept up with The Fountainhead. I was psychologically entranced. There's the only way I could put it. And I then proceeded to suck up every Ayn Rand book I could possibly find. And Now, I also wasn't, I would, again, as with my reading of classics way ahead of, over my head, I was reading Ayn Rand in a way sort of over my head. But I was absorbing everything like a sponge. And so, did I discriminate between Murray Rothbard, Nathaniel Branden, Libertarian X, Anarchist Y, person of it? No, I was reading it all. I was going to read everything even remotely related. Everything, even that's the way I was. I was a readaholic kid. My mom, she was almost a concern. I mean, 12-year-old, she has a 12-year-old son on her hand. You got Sunday afternoon free. What do you want to do? There's nothing else to do. Could you take me to the library, Mom? I mean, that's what I was. In my room, I would have stacks of books at a time that I was reading. And my parents were like, gosh, maybe we should encourage him to have other. But my parents, again, were like, well, maybe he's going through. I never got over that book phase. I still kept reading and reading and reading voluminously, just huge amounts. And so by the time I started university when I was 16. And that's they were starting a conservative newspaper at the University of California at San Diego, and they heard me in class. Literally, I was taking an American intellectual history class from John Dickens about American conservatives who'd been former communists. His book Up from Communism. So they were studying people like James Burnham and Max Eastman, and well, that was totally right up my alley, obviously. And so I couldn't miss Dickens on American intellectual history. I'm answering questions in class. Someone hears me, pontificating in class. They say, "You got to be on the staff of our newspaper, our conservative paper." And I was conservative, so I was already conservative. I'm a libertarian. And they said, "Well, how about this? For our first issue, we want to send you up to interview Nathaniel Branden. And will you do an interview with Nathaniel Branden at his home in Beverly Hills?" Sure. And with their imprimatur, I could write a letter. "I'm writing for the California Review, and would you do an interview with Nathaniel Branden?" So I took my buddy, who was a photographer. We went up, and we spent Saturday, all day Saturday at Nathaniel Branden's home in Beverly Hills. When I invited him to come speak at the University of California, San Diego, and that's where he first gave the benefits and hazards of the philosophy of Ayn Rand. I introduced him. I arranged the.
Oh, hold on. So you were actually to blame
Yes.
for the benefits and hazards of the philosophy of
Well,
Ayn Rand.
the content, I was surprised at the content, let me put it that way, but I was open to him, and that is my fault. I did not have the information, the proper, but I didn't have the data. And I give myself the slack. Part of why I wrote my first book, The Passion of Ayn Rand's Critics, about the Brandons, is that I was this sucked into the libertarian world kind of kid who loved Ayn Rand, who grasped some basics about objectivism, but then got sucked in just as the Peikoff would say, yeah, that's the danger of these people. They'll suck people like you, smart young men like you, into this. And I was. And so when I moved to New York, for example, one of the first things I did was go meet Murray Rothbard. Within my first week of living in New York, I'm working at Laissez-Faire Books in their brick and mortar shop in Greenwich Village. I'm going to NYU, so it's just a walk from class for me, but I become the weekend sales clerk there at Laissez-Faire Books, and I get to meet Roy Child. One day, Douglas Rasmussen and Tibor Machan come walking in. So I'm meeting all these libertarian intellectuals. Murray Rothbard invites me to participate in, he's writing his History of Economic Thought, and he's going to do a seminar on it through the Center for Libertarian Studies, and he invites me to participate in it. And there, Douglas Rasmussen and I and several other people are graduate students in economics and history. Or I was just fortunate enough to walk, let me put it this way, I had the balls, the chutzpah to walk right up to people I wanted to ask questions of and study from, and I did. And
but that's a good thing. Like you said, well, I got, unfortunately got swept up into this, but to me, that's like, if you're a young kid, right? You're what, 18, 17, 18, and you've got the chance to learn personally from Murray Rothbard. And I get all his flaws, and I just differ with him on an awful lot, but a fool he wasn't, right? You're talking about a very, very bright guy, incredibly knowledgeable, and an absolute brilliant economist. I mean, Ayn Rand didn't have him in her inner circle because he was a fool, right? When he was just a young kid. So, or a younger guy anyway. So why wouldn't it be a good thing? As long as you maintain that intellectual independence that you talked about earlier. You're talking about Tibor Machan, Douglas Rasmussen, and these people all don't agree with each other either. I mean, they're Aristotelians and egoists, but not exactly objectivists. And Rothbard, of course, is an anarchist. I mean, I read all these guys and I learned from them from books, but you've got the opportunity where you're with them. So where I'm reading, say, the Libertarian Manifesto, Rothbard's book, and I come across something where I'm like, well, this doesn't make sense. You have the opportunity to say to him, well, this doesn't make sense. Explain it to me. And maybe he clarifies, maybe he says, that's not what I really meant, but whatever it is, your mind is expanding. And I get the sense, and it's just based on anecdotal evidence from social media, that there are a lot of objectivists out there that right away hear the name Rothbard. Oh, no, Rothbard. No, he's horrible. He
I
libeled
learned
Ayn
so
Rand.
much from him. I am
Right.
grateful for what he taught me, for all of my disagreements and errors, for all of the unfairness. Now, I have publicly said that I think he was dishonest and unfair in his treatment of Ayn Rand.
Well, he actually
I can
told
morally
you as much.
evaluate. I can morally evaluate. He did tell me that. I asked him point blank.
Which also
I read his
wouldn't have
stuff on
happened if
Ayn
you
Rand.
didn't know him. Right.
Exactly. And I could confront him. And that's really was very helpful. I could say, hey, you say in the sociology of the Ayn Rand cult that people were booted out for not liking Rachmaninoff. Well, who was ever excommunicated, to use your term, for not liking Rachmaninoff? Oh, well, Jim, that was fictionalized. His exact word to me, fictionalized. And so there's no one. Okay, so you made that up. Yeah, I could spell that out. See, a lot of people who would read that, oh, if they knew better, they knew better. Rothbard is just a liar, to be dismissed. And to all the young students, you don't even read Rothbard, right? I think there's a danger in that, right? Whereas I read his critique of Ayn Rand, then walked right up to him, asked him about it. Yeah. Oh, so those details aren't necessarily accurate. I get it, which is actually a much stronger permanent inoculation against his smears.
Absolutely. Yes.
So you're right. We don't help ourselves by putting our head in the sand and evading. But you see, people knew something that I didn't say about Ayn Rand. For example, in '68, Brannon had said, Ayn Rand wanted an affair, but I could never have had an affair with a woman who was 14 years older than me. Okay. So I had assumed from 1968 to mid 1980s, he was telling the world that no such affair had occurred. So in 1982, when I'm introducing him at the benefits and hazards of the philosophy of Ayn Rand, he says, I said, why don't you get the question period? Just have them raise their hands. No, Jim, we want written questions, and I want you to read the questions out loud and screen any you think are dubious. I didn't understand why we would do such a procedure, but I agreed. And so when it was all done and we're walking away from the lecture, Nathaniel Brandon asked me, well, Jim, were any questions screened out? And I said, well, just one. The question, first, it sounded intellectual, rude, and irrelevant. But besides, we all know the truth of it, whether you and Ayn Rand had an affair. His face, there was this embarrassed silence before Barbara Brandon's book came out, before anyone knew about the affair. There's embarrassed, his face turns different shades of color. And I realized, ooh, there's something here that I'm not aware of. There's something more going on here than meets the eye. And again, you see, it was that engagement. And frankly, it was his talk, as he's giving the talk, the benefits and hazards. There were like moments where I was like, I don't think that's fair to Ayn Rand. I don't think that's fair to Ayn Rand. I have to get back to you on that in my own head. Because damn, what was I? Only 17 or 18, like you say, 17 I had to be because I hadn't moved to New York yet. So I was 17 years old. I could cut myself a little slack. Yeah, and it was engaging with these people that actually helped me very much become more of an objectivist. Understand, it inspired me to study the philosophy more seriously. So I get my undergraduate degree from New York University. Magna cum laude. I did really well. I loved philosophy. They had a bunch of Austrian economists there at NYU. I studied with Israel Kirzner, and they had such a coterie of excellent Austrian economists there. Larry White, Gerald O'Driscoll, Mario Rizzo, Louis Lachman was there as the guest lecturer when I was there. So wow, all I could tell you is I did have an opportunity to study from libertarians, libertarian economists, and philosophers. That was, again, what a wonderful, again, but that's my virtue. There, I can't just give credit to my parents and a lucky background. There, I had the sense and the
Yeah.
focus to at least be studying that sort of thing. And they got me to critically read important stuff that I would never have otherwise read, and that I'm very grateful for having read. Yeah, uh, there are no evil thoughts, if I can quote John Galt. It's the refusal to think that's evil. So, ladies and gentlemen, there's no index of forbidden books out there. Study them all, even if Ayn Rand said that they were dishonest monsters sometimes. Not always, just not because she said there was dishonest monsters, but even if they were dishonest monsters, there are things that I have learned from dishonest monsters, believe it or not. It's ad hominem to judge the quality of an argument based on the character of the person who makes it. And although it may be affected by their, twisted judgment or something, nonetheless, they can still be making good points. Or I can't tell you how much I learned from Murray Rothbard. Every time, I mean, I tell you the story how he always seemed to have a book that was relevant on his person, mind you. We'd be talking about some subject, some obscure economic historical subject. Oh, yeah, I got a book on that. And he'd hand me the book on it. It was like, wow, how did you just happen to have a book on the topic we were talking about that I brought up? Uh,
Yeah.
no,
Yeah.
he was.
See, I like that you said that with what you said just now, because a person's character is irrelevant to the argument that they make. Now,
Yeah,
if a person is saying things like this happened, or that happened, and you know the person to be a liar, well, then it's relevant because now you have to question what they're
yeah.
saying. But the logic of an argument, their character is not relevant. Somebody recently made a comment about me after a show on, ARC UK, and they said, well, this guy's an ex-convict. Why should he be telling us about morality? And I'm just thinking, if I tell you it's raining out, are you going to say, well, this guy's an ex-convict, so I'm just going to go, there's no way he can be right? You can check it out. You know what I mean? Even if I'm still the same scumbag I was when I was 21, doesn't mean I can't be right if I say A is A or life is the standard of value. So it's just such a horrible argument.
And see, when idiots talk like that, they are making more of a confession about their poor character than anything about your character, Michael. Rather than try and figure out who you are now, learn about your background, learn about what you've done since, learn about your character as you have created it now, which is an impressive thing. What they're doing is they're being, in effect, dogmatic intrinsicists in their judgment.
She
And
was, but I have to tell you, I got a chuckle because you said idiots, but she actually lapped some praise onto you. She's- she-
I that doesn't do it. See, someone can praise me and they can. I have been, and the other thing is false praise, and people trying to sucker you in with, oh yeah, you're smart, you're wonderful. I've learned to distrust, and that's a sad state of affairs, isn't it? I've learned to distrust flattery. I've learned to and I've learned not to be afraid of disagreement. That is to say, where I have a strong disagreement, maybe that's where I can learn the most. Within recently, I was a DA, went to law school, studied Bernard Segan, the great libertarian constitutional theorist, right when he was being nominated to the Ninth Circuit by Ronald Reagan. And the Senate, Senator Kennedy refused to give him a hearing before the Senate Judiciary Committee for something like a year and a half. And so, people complain, well, the Republicans don't give Obama's Garland hearing for a year. Oh, don't give me that. You guys have been delaying on the Democrats. My professor, and he said, Jim, you'll be a clerk of mine if I get on the Ninth Circuit. And he said, but I don't think I'm going to get on the Ninth Circuit. I think Ted Kennedy isn't going to give me a hearing. But he finally took him to a vote, and he got voted down eventually. But the point is, they wouldn't even allow someone with a consistent view of property rights and a view of what the 14th Amendment really means about economic liberties, and what a brilliant scholar he was. In any event, I clerk at a big law firm in downtown LA, Melvin and Myers. And it was then that I went up in the elevator with Henry Kissinger. Why? Because one of the partners at the firm was Warren Christopher, Clinton's Secretary of State. And that's the kind of law firm it was in downtown LA. And they were doing at the time the asbestos litigation, because they were defending one of the vast insurance companies that were involved in this vast, class action lawsuit on, asbestos. And I could see, I was doing deposition digests of expert witnesses, and I could go into the room, and they had a giant room, literally with 5,000 expert depositions. And the whole thing was going to be settled out of court anyway. This is never going to go to trial. It's going to be a giant settlement, and it's just going to be I knew this was the kind of law I did not want to do. I did not want to be a politician. I did not want to grease palms. I did not want to backslap people. One of the partners at the firm took me to one of these swanky, the California club with these very elite, and he's trying to get me, oh, you want to be one of us, don't you? I'm like, there's nothing about that appeals to me. There's really nothing about that appeals to me. And I knew what I didn't want to do. I wanted to be the guy in court doing criminal trials, having fun doing trials. First of all, the mental challenge of actually being a daily litigator in front of a judge. These civil lawyers, they spend 99%, they never see the inside of a courtroom. I wanted to be in the courtroom, and I wanted to do justice. So that meant I couldn't be a federal prosecutor. And there's no way I was going to do all those economic antitrust cases, tax cases, immigration cases. Evil itself. I would have regarded that as being an agent of evil had I been a federal lawyer for the feds, in some sense. So what I became on purpose was a local prosecutor, so I could prosecute. We do most of the murders, rapes, armed robberies, child molests, domestic violence. Those were the guys I wanted to get. And if there was going to be some reform, I figured the best reform would be like legalizing drugs, or at least liberalizing. And I could effectuate some change in that regard when I was a prosecutor. I loved the work. It was rewarding work. I had such fun. Every morning, I would be like the first person there in the morning. I would be driving my white Honda to work, and there I was, Prince Valiant on my white steed, going to do justice every day. I loved that work. Did it for almost 18 years. But towards the end, health began to make that impossible. I had an ongoing health issue. It's a chronic health problem that I just live with. Let's forget about that. I don't want to talk about that. But that chronic health problem made it impossible for me to be when you're doing trials, you can't just say, hey, give me a day or two to recover. No, your personal health issues cannot cause a delay in a murder trial.
Right.
Okay. Just ain't going to happen. The judge ain't going to let that happen. And so I had to leave this work that I loved so much. And I can't tell you anything else. I got depressed. I was not feeling good about myself. I felt like my fun, my purpose, the challenges in my life, all that justice I was doing. I mean, I just felt so good in every way about what I was doing. I couldn't do it anymore. And so a buddy of mine who's a psychologist, a psychotherapist, took me to these men's retreats in LA. And I read the brochure on that. I'm like, this is new agey, touchy feely, outside of my comfort zone, like nothing you can believe. Right? You can imagine, totally outside my comfort zone, some of this, a rebirthing experiment, for example, that they were doing. I went to that. My buddy was very wise. He said, Jim, you're not going to get any more out of this than you put into this. And you are laughing at the rebirthing thing. That's what you have to go to.
Right.
because
Where you're resistant.
where I was resistant. And so I did, and I got into it. And I turned myself as vulnerable, I opened myself just as vulnerably as I could. And I got I got absolutely, because I stepped out of my comfort zone, I experienced as an objectivist. Now, let me speak to all the objectivists out there. I stepped out of my comfort zone as an objectivist and got a huge ka-ching reward. One of the great selfish rewards of my life was connecting with these guys, developing some tools that could help me retool my life and get me off my duff. And guess what immediately happened? I finished a 30-year project, Creating Christ.
We're going to get to that. Hold on.
So, but the point though I'm trying to make is, you're making a good point. Objectivists, you got to get out of your comfort zone. It is only in those terra incognita that we really grow, stretch, learn, and become bigger, better people. I was a better husband, a better friend when I came back from those things, and none of those guys were objectivists. They were just doing honest psychotherapy, men's work together, and some of those guys were overcoming addictions. Some of those guys were overcoming other issues. I explained my problem, and suddenly it felt like I was nothing compared to these. But nonetheless, guys with more serious problems than me were giving me unbelievable visibility and support, and could give me help about my own life. And so, objectivists out there, step out of your comfort zone. Really, 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 that's where the growth happens.
Okay. Now, so I want to back up a little bit, because there's a moment or a period in your life that I think impacts you tremendously and is very influential on your thinking and your future. At some point, you meet Leonard Peikoff and you develop a relationship with him. First of all, how did you meet him, and what was it like being, I don't want to say just a student, because you're also a friend. So what was that like, having Leonard Peikoff for a teacher and a friend?
My experience with Leonard Peikoff is probably the most amazing human, outside of my wife or my parents, the most important human relationship I've ever had in a number of ways and a number of levels. I was in New York City, and I had already absorbed all the taped lecture courses from Leonard Peikoff that were then available. The philosophy of objectivism, the history of philosophy, logic, objective communication. I was sucking it all up like a sponge and going back and taking those courses a second and a third time if necessary. That's how important Leonard Peikoff's courses were for me. But then I'm still not sure I'm not a libertarian in 1983, 84, 85. Honestly, I wouldn't have called myself an objectivist. I wouldn't have had the self-esteem to say, I know I deserve that title. Does that make sense? And
Yes.
so, but in 1983 in New York City, at the old Roosevelt Hotel in Manhattan, where they have all those illegals now, the old Roosevelt Hotel in Manhattan, Leonard Peikoff gave Understanding Objectivism live when I was living in New York City. And so I had to take that live, and I did take it live. And I got to know people who were associated with Leonard Peikoff socially through that and through taking the taped lecture courses. So even though I wasn't quite sure of my identity yet, philosophically, I was starting to socialize with them. George Reisman and Edith Packer started a lecture organization called the Thomas Jefferson School in the 1980s. And in 1983, 85, 87, 89, they did summer conferences in San Diego, where all the great objectivist intellectuals would, wow, it was awesome. Alan Gotthelf on Aristotle. At the time of his death, Alan Gotthelf was the most widely cited academically cited authority on Aristotle's science. Edwin Locke, the most widely cited authority on motivational psychology. Some of these great intellectuals. I met Edward Teller, the inventor of the hydrogen bomb. But of course, Leonard Peikoff and Harry Binswanger. But back in those days, even David Kelly. Talk about great economists there. He had Walter Williams there. He had Hans Zenholz. He had, all kinds of great economists that were friends of George Reisman would be there too. Bernie Segan, my law professor, was a teacher there. So every one of those summer conferences, I happened to live in Southern California. So I got to attend all those personally. So I got to know, okay, at the first summer conference, since I know San Diego, George Reisman calls me up and says, would you be kind enough to help us coordinate some of the practical things with the Jefferson School? I said, sure, I'll meet people at the airport. You know, I've held the sign at the airport, Jefferson School, right? Come to the mini van that'll take you to the university. And so I was meeting people at the airport who were arriving for the conference. And I was also helping people with practical stuff. You know, where's the local store for this? And where's the, because, you know, it was 2 weeks of a conference there, is where people were taking their vacations and planning up to do these objectivist conferences. And so I was doing practical stuff because I was a local. I got this really cool call. Leonard Peikoff has to pick up some supplies for the next week, and he was wondering if you would drive him and go shopping with him because you know this area. I said, yeah, I'd absolutely love to. So the first time, while I had taken Understanding Objectivism live, and it was a revolution because I had doubts about objectivism, and those doubts were pretty much cleared up with Understanding Objectivism. I had walked in being conditioned by the Brandons and Rothbard into thinking that, you know, the world of Rand and Peikoff is an intolerant place that won't let you think for yourself. And, you know, I was thinking to myself, yeah, if someone's going to tell me what music I can like, if someone's going to tell me if being gay is immoral or something, you know, and that was just an off the cuff comment Ayn Rand once made in a question and answer period. If someone's going to tell me who me or my friends can love, then this is some kind of cult and I don't want to be involved in it. Leonard Peikoff does Understanding Objectivism. And I'm like, thank you, thank you, thank you. That just fixed my main problem with objectivism because all these guys were leading me astray on it. When I do the Jefferson School, I really start studying objectivism more seriously because I'm meeting very serious objectivists. Historian Robert Hessen, oh my God, you know, really smart people were giving me some really good advice, and I had some great opportunities to talk to them about history and economics and philosophy. I have this chance to go shopping with Leonard Peikoff, and that's my first real interaction with him. I'm pushing this sometimes because of his background. I want to push the shopping cart. Then there are other times, oh no, you push the shopping cart. And just going around the store with him that first time, I suddenly realized what a benevolent. Okay, I meet Brandon. I walk away, and my buddy, the photographer I'm with, well, so what'd you think of him? God, he's a bit of a pompous ass, isn't he? He's a bit of a pretentious jerk, isn't he? Meet Murray Rothbard. My buddy that I was living in, my roommate in New York at the time was like, what do you think of Murray? And I'm like, well, when you talk about Ayn Rand, he seems a little bitter. It seems like, you know, he's a friendly guy, but he seems very bitter about Ayn Rand. I meet Leonard Peikoff. He's childlike, open, innocent. He was the embodiment of intellectual honesty. If you hear his lectures, you know how he makes himself the counterexample. It was my rationalism.
Yeah.
It was my mistake. I'll teach you using my mistake as the foil. He does that every time. Or in his positive examples in his communication course, you want to give examples. For example, you know, he's embodying the very principles that he is articulating. And sometimes it's weird. You'll be going through a course, and the second time I'll hear it, and I didn't realize he was embodying the very thing that he was. So I sensed an honesty and integrity to him. And when you were talking to him, it was you, him, and reality. There was no bullshit, no middleman. There was your honest view of things and reality. And no one, I had studied at NYU from brilliant professors. I had known some very, very good teachers and some brilliant people up to that point. No one impressed me with his intellectual honesty. And that's the way I describe it, his intellectual honesty. He was full of laughs and jokes. I would always have even dirty jokes. I would always, when I met with Leonard, I knew I would have a joke ready because he loved to joke around. He loved, and when he got into art, when he got into music or art, he turned himself over to it in a way that was just, there was something honest about Leonard, honest. Nonetheless, although I was becoming friendly through the course of the 1980s with the Objectivists, it still came as a surprise to me when I got the invitation to attend his seminars at Leonard Peikoff's home when he was finishing up his treatise, The Definitive Statement of Objectivism, Objectivism, the Philosophy of Ayn Rand. He's finishing it up. You want to give him chapter by chapter comments in a discussion in Leonard Peikoff's living room on Saturday nights? Yeah, I'll take that. Yeah. Well, first I was like, you sure he wants me? Does he really want me? I'm not a professor of philosophy or physics, and maybe those are the kind of people he should have there at the seminar. And don't worry, we'll have PhDs in various subjects there. He wants a variety, and he specifically wants you. God knows why. I eagerly said yes. I was the first person there that first night. In fact, I was typically the first person there because I would be driving in from San Diego up to his house in Laguna, where he lived at the time. And because I was there early and he was still getting ready for that evening's discussion, I would play with Kira, his daughter, who was still just a 2, 3, 4-year-old as we were doing this. And I would sit there and it astonished me how he parented Kira. He spoke to her very simply, but like an adult. There was no baby talk. Sure, he was fun and playful and he was at her level, but he was talked in complete sentences and was training her conceptually and observing her conceptually. I was absolutely astonished at the way Cynthia and Leonard were raising Kira too. But those discussions were utterly electric. Outside of reading Atlas Shrugged or Introduction to Objectivist Epistemology, that was the most formative on my way because the way you put it earlier was exactly it. No, Leonard, I've always had this question. He has the break with David Kelly, and so he interrupts that Saturday to read out loud to us Fact and Value, and he's emotional and angry, and the whole room is silent. He says, we're not going to do chapter 3 or 4, whatever it was that night. We're going to do Fact and Value. Now, after he's done reading it, you can tell he's angry, right? Are there any questions? Everyone is post-traumatic stress. No one is going to raise their hand. I'm the only one who raises his hand. Leonard, and I was able to ask him right there a substantive philosophical question like, I always got Ayn Rand's solution to the Izzat problem this way. Values, properly understood, are fact-based and fact-laden. It's a factual relationship. I understand how all values are fact-laden, but you say here that all facts are value-laden. Now, that's something I never really understood. How are facts, in a world without living organisms, obviously there's no values to them, right? Well, yes, of course. Okay, so apart from that, how could the amount of dust particles on the dark side of the moon of Jupiter on a certain day have any value implications to life on Earth? It was amazing. He calms down. The anger of Von Kelly is all gone. And he gives me this amazing tour de force on mental integration and how the most remote fact in the universe, how no fact is irrelevant to human life, how there is no matter how distant in the galaxy it could possibly be, it's not irrelevant to human life or potentially irrelevant to human life and therefore laden with value implications. A tour de force, I was able to ask those kind of questions where I had some doubt about objectivism, where I hadn't clearly understood something about objectivism. I could raise my hand and I could do the little back and forth. Or, and then we were done with Opar, he just wanted those Saturday nights to continue. So we continued with those Saturday nights and we did plays and we did poems and we did induction and we did everything that he was interested in. And we just continued with it. One night, oh gosh, a friend of mine from New York, this guy I met when I was living in New York, was a literature expert, brilliant literature guy. One night, he and I sat down together. I didn't like poetry. High school English had killed poetry. Talk about stupid in my head. And I had less kind words than stupid for it. And so my buddy said, no, you're going to love poetry, Jim. Let me teach you what poetry is. And he recites from memory these beautiful poems. And suddenly we start talking about what poetry is. And we develop this theory of poetry and a definition. And we're really proud of this definition of poetry from Ayn Rand's aesthetic perspective and from anyone's aesthetic perspective, frankly. We're just really proud of our objective definition of poetry. So I get to Leonard Peikoff's house. One night I have a moment and I say, Leonard, I have developed with my friend the objective definition of poetry. And you tell a philosopher that you've done, oh yeah? He gives me one of those, oh, yes. Oh, okay, Jim, you take the floor and do that. I explained to him it. One of the greatest compliments of my entire life was after my presentation, he said, can I steal that definition?
Nice. That's
Nice.
great.
And so I read in the 75th anniversary edition to Anthem, he writes an introduction in the 1990s to the 70th, and he uses my definition of poetry, the marriage of sound and meaning. And I'm like, and that is one of the supreme compliments of my life. But that's the kind of interaction that I had with him. I do this, my wife and I developed this pilot for a TV talk show called Ideas in Action. And of course, he's the first guy we interviewed. We wanted to get into his house and show people the art, because the art, the sculptures and the painting, and we have him playing piano, and we go into his home and we do Ideas in Action, and the pilot wins awards. We won a cinema and industry award because it was really high end quality. And we're told by people, although it's played on TV, we never get picked up as a series, but people years later come back to us, you really changed the way interview shows were done with Ideas in Action. And our show on Leonard Peikoff was just, so Leonard very much, he was a fan of mine. I felt that he really believed in me. He cornered me one day on his dining room table. And he said, Jim, you really seem to get objectivism. Why aren't you, is there any way I can talk you into being a philosopher? And I explained to him, Leonard, you're never going to see the effect in your own life of this, are you? Maybe not even Kira's life is this going to have. Yeah, I'm writing for the ages. I need to see the effect of my work in my own lifetime. I need the feedback. I need that guilty verdict from the jury to know that I did justice. That serial rapist is now off the streets. I need that feedback about what I'm doing in my lifetime. And he understood. He totally got it, and said, okay, but don't forget philosophy, because you may have something to contribute. And it was always amazing to me. I had read the Brandon's biographies in the 1980s and 90s when they came out. And I was writing my own critique because there were contradictions that flew off. I had met Barbara Brandon at her home in Hollywood before The Passion of Ayn Rand came out, before she'd published her biography. I actually had a chance to meet Barbara Brandon. So I met everyone. And she struck me as a kind of a ditz. But she asked me about, how Ayn Rand had influenced me and my friends, and she was taking notes and all that and stuff. And do you mind if I record it? But she seemed like kind of an airhead to me. Anyway, I read her book and I was like, this is contradictions central, left and right. So Leonard Peikoff, of course, when he does his Ford Hall Forum speech, My 30 Years with Ayn Rand, said, I'm not even going to read Barbara's book. I'm her cousin. I know these people. I know who they are, and I know what they're all about, and I'm not going to read it. It's, in my mind, the status of arbitrary. And okay, so when I was the internet was just a new thing in the year 2000, still relatively new. On a friend's website, in serialized form, I published a series of essays critical of Barbara Brandon's biography, but I didn't tell Leonard, who I obviously knew very well by then. I'm working at the DA's office. I come home from the office. My wife meets me at the front door. You're going to want to answer that. You're going to return this phone call right away. Who was it? Leonard. I mean, Leonard had come to our wedding party, my mom's house, right? I mean, that's how well I knew Leonard. And so the fact that I hadn't told him about this, I don't know, am I in trouble? So I call Leonard up, and he's like, Jim, why didn't you tell me that you'd written this critique of Barbara's book? Well, you said you weren't even going to read it. I didn't know how you'd respond to anyone even doing a positive. It's not. I love it. I agree with it. Do you think you could use Ayn Rand's notes on Nathaniel Brandon? Yeah, I think I might be able to. So after reading my critique of Barbara Brandon's book, he kicked open the doors. Well, this is before the archives had really gotten everything worked out. He gave me access to everything. Everything, all of Ayn Rand's memorabilia, photographs, personal journals, letters, notes, you name it. And he gave me, for free, the exclusive copyright rights to Ayn Rand's private journal notes on Nathaniel Brandon. For free. This makes me write my first book, The Passion of Ayn Rand's Critics, and I have the opportunity to work with him on editing it. Every single line and every single page of that book Leonard Peikoff read aloud in my presence as we carefully went over it. Whew, what an editor, because Ayn Rand had basically taught him how to write. And oh man, another amazing experience of my life was going through him with the editing of The Passion of Ayn Rand's Critics. He's like, okay, do you want New American Library? You want this to be part of the Ayn Rand library? No. This is about Nathaniel Branden. It is not essential to objectivism. I think we should develop, I should go to an independent publisher anyway. Peikoff was quietly nodding his agreement with all of my strategy. And so I wrote my first book, The Passion of Ayn Rand's Critics. All I can tell you is that the experience of working with Leonard Peikoff was just an unbelievable, unmatchable experience in my life. The man was the embodiment of intellectual honesty. He cared about the truth and nothing but the truth, and nothing else mattered to him. Not anyone's personality. You know, people give him all kinds of grief, but he hates these breaks. He hates schisms. He doesn't, you know, he's this, you know, the way he explained it to me, he says, when someone first told me you'd written something on the Brandons, my first thought, I admit, Jim, was, am I going to have to pick a fight with Jim now? And he said, when I read it, I said, oh, thank God I don't have to pick a fight.
Jim, I got to ask you, a lot of right-wingers who are associated with objectivism, or closed border types who associate themselves with objectivism, they're quick to cite Leonard Peikoff, and I believe they're using him badly in this sense. But they like to point out, well, you know, he did vote for Trump. He said he voted for Trump, or, you know, in his later years, he saw the left as a bigger threat, and he's opposed to open borders. What are your thoughts and feelings when that happens? Because I'm sure you see it on social media.
The people, and when someone uses a self-description like objectivism, it really means nothing to me anymore. They may as well have called themselves, you know, a three-headed Martian. Absolutely is meaningless a word to me. I have to hear what they really believe before I even know this. And the people who argue that are typically people who buy into Trump's arguments for it. And Peikoff, while he did vote for Trump and does believe that he believes, well, we were just discussing Milton Friedman. He believes that it's sort of the same idea, although obviously the principles are not quite the same, that you can't have an unlimited welfare state and unlimited immigration at the same time. The two are inconsistent. And if you were to give him a cultural argument, it's poisoning the blood of America, or we're culturally overwhelmed, Leonard Peikoff would be violently opposed to that. He would tell you that no, Italian immigration, Jewish immigration, Asian immigration, that didn't corrupt America. Anyone who uses cultural or racial arguments, they're wrong on immigration. He would be fierce, emotional, ferocious against any kind of cultural pollution type argument. We're going to lose America, or the voting base of America is going to change or something. That is not the kind of argument that he would accept. Obviously, he would not accept these stupid economic arguments. They're taking my job away. They're hurting the economy. They're, you know, the economy, our standard of living is being brought down. He understood that all of that was BS too. So any kind of economic argument just on immigration, as opposed to, say, government having to respond to. Now, what we have at the border today is an inhuman nightmare that both sides are responsible for. The human trafficking, the slavery, the rape. This is the black market in human beings. The ugliest black market there can be. And why? They haven't legalized it. They haven't legalized. It's in this quasi black market situation where people are coming across the border illegally, but then being encouraged through the welfare state to get here. Now, that is a perverse situation when Joe Biden hands them an ATM card and a flight to whatever city they want to be in, and then they get to a local city that'll put them up in the Hotel Roosevelt in Manhattan until further notice. Okay, that is untenable. This welfare system response to immigration encourages bad immigrants. A free market, if we had a free market, we'd be selecting for the virtuous immigrants, wouldn't we? Only those who want to come here to really just be free and live their life, as opposed to, should we be concerned with Islamic terrorism in the wake of October 7th. Yeah, should we be concerned about Venezuela opening its prisons? I am not like Harry Binswanger. I think we should have a border. I agree with you. There's nothing in the Constitution. I need a constitutional amendment to do this. But I would advocate a constitutional amendment that says that the federal government could run a border, but not to keep people out as such, but to filter out dangerous criminals, terrorists, people with infectious deadly diseases. If you pose a physical harm, a physical threat to the people in the country, we have a right to keep you out, it seems to me, even in an ideal world. And we are far from an ideal world. We're living in a world right now in which Trump wants to keep people out for economic and cultural purposes. The Democrats want everybody in, and millions of people, who knows what criminals, terrorists, diseases, whatnot, are coming in, even as people are being sold into effective slavery. And women and children are being raped as they come across the border. Now, that is an unspeakable humanitarian crisis, which is the direct effect of the law that's not being or semi-being enforced at the border. And Trump, even if he were to enforce the border, could only marginally correct the problem. It's still going to be happening under Trump's regime. So I think there can be reasonable differences of opinion on this subject. To me, it's not who you vote for. The real test of being an objectivist is that you understand that whether you're voting for Biden or Trump or Robert Kennedy or the libertarian, there are profound problems. Admit to the problems or you're not an objectivist. I don't care who you're voting for, but I will not argue the point that some people have. Do the Democrats look like they're falling over a totalitarian bridge right now? Absolutely. Does it look like the Republicans have cashed in any principle that they once had? Absolutely. So I can understand voting against Trump. I can understand voting against Biden.
Sure.
What I can't understand is the enthusiasm for, and Leonard wouldn't, and while he voted for Trump, he's not saying I endorse Trump's philosophy. By no means. It's more like Ayn Rand, when she voted for Nixon, invented the term anti-Nixonites for Nixon, as she held her nose to vote against McGovern.
That's a strong point. Okay, my last question has to do with that book, Over Your Left Shoulder,
Yeah.
Creating Christ. Now, we've already done an episode on the content of the book. What I want to know, Jim, is where it lies in your hierarchy of values. What does the accomplishment mean to you? What is your emotional experience writing the book and having completed it and being able to discuss it on various platforms and just having it being taken seriously by scholars? I mean, this is not some fringe work. That's what I want to know.
I did not expect that. What was it, 35 years ago, when I had the light bulb go off in my head for the inspiration, I came up with a causal explanation for Christianity. And you can understand why in all of history, that subject would not be the one that would be subject to the most, say, objective scientific scrutiny. But most other subjects, whether it's the American Civil War, the plays of Shakespeare, we put into its historical context and we give it causal explanation if we're being serious as historical scientists. And I figured that I could give a causal explanation for why Christianity emerged, when it did, and in the form it did. And that's how important I think what I've done is. I think there are all kinds of benevolent byproducts to it. But I also think that in 100 years, it will be simply assumed to be true. The thesis, as radical as it is controversial, and it is controversial. I mean, I can't claim that I've achieved scholarly consensus by any means yet, but I honestly thought it was so radical, and I was an outsider academically in this area, this was my moment where I was being like Leonard, writing for the ages. Maybe in 100 years, someone will dust the book off and say, "Oh, these guys had a point." And I was writing for the ages that way. I did not imagine that we would get the praise that we got from Professor Robert Eisenman, or that someone would want to make a documentary out of it, and that there'd be other experts who would agree with our thesis, and all of that. And it's still selling like gangbusters. I can't even believe it. It's in all formats. at Amazon.com and Barnes & Noble if you get interested in buying it. Creative Christ. We have a website, www.creatingchrist.com. And there is a documentary based on it, Creating Christ, available through Netflix and Amazon if you're interested in the documentary. I didn't know that we would have that. And so I'm kind of giddy. It was actually after 30 years of working on it. And, as I say, it was kind of the old stupid, mystical saying, when fate closes a door, it opens another one for you, and that sort of thing. It just worked out that I got my shit together psychologically so that I could complete the work. And I did. I probably should have completed it earlier, frankly. But it did take a long time. And it was only at that end there that we discovered some of the last and best archaeological evidence that we had. And I had an experience very much like the way Ayn Rand describes Atlas Shrugged. After working on something for 35 years, when you hold the physical book in your hand, there was that moment too. The galleys, the editor, we approved the last galleys, and I've still got correct. Oh, but did he get my last corrections? And I literally kind of go into this semi-panic attack. And so it's not until I physically get the book. Oh, they got the last galley corrections. Thank goodness they're in there. So I'm holding the book in my hand. That's it. Just the physical reality. I had an aesthetic experience. My abstract values were rendered into a concrete that I could emotionally experience. And that was it. I was so satisfied. I literally turned to my wife. I can die a happy man. It's not that I want to die. I want many more years with you still, my dear love. But I could die a happy man in theory. Does that make sense?
Yes.
I knew that I had added my contribution to that area in the way I knew I could, and done it well and done it properly and given my best case for it. And as I say, I think in 100 years from now, because of how much notoriety I'm getting because of it, and the book is getting because of it, I think in 100 years, it'll just simply be the truth taken for granted about Christianity. That's how confident I am in my thesis.
That is awesome, Jim. And I think it's a great place to stop. Before we do, though, where can people find you?
I am a regular. Now, this last week I took off, but I am a regular on the podcast of the Ayn Rand Center, United Kingdom. I am one of Rosie Ginsburg's loyal minions. As people there know, I am a ferocious advocate of the cause of Israel and the cause of objectivism and applying objectivism to all aspects of human life. We do, for subscribers, we do special lectures and discussion groups. Tomorrow, for example, we're doing Leonard Peikoff's History of Philosophy course, and we are up to Hume and Kant now. But you can get them, if you're a subscriber at a certain level, you can get all the recordings of all of my discussions. And we've done discussions now on induction through physics and philosophy, objectivism through induction, history of philosophy. We're going to be doing logic coming up. And we have intensive worldwide Zoom conferences where people can participate and discuss this. And I can sort of guide them through an understanding of Leonard Peikoff and his best courses. And I do that. So Ayn Rand Center UK, subscribe if you're interested. I'm also active on Facebook. Social media, social X, I've gotten there somewhat. I'm still mostly active on Facebook, where I answer questions every day, practically of the week. I'm admin at a couple of pages there. Roman Provenance of Christianity, Ayn Rand, the John Galt line. I also have my own page there. So if you have questions, come on over to Facebook. On any of this, I answer questions just about every day.
He does. And I'll say about the ARC UK also that I'm a guest on the reality show frequently. And if one tunes into my appearances, you can frequently hear Jim Valliant's objections to what I'm saying as it's read, and it's usually written in all capitals because he becomes absolutely irate with me. So that will be great.
Only a person of deep insight can piss me off that intensely. If I really have a low view of someone, they can't upset me at all. The all caps shows that I think you're brilliant and that you care and that you're honest and that it matters. And besides, I like differences of opinion. I mean, we have to have some back and forth and differences of opinion. And frankly, the points you usually make are grounded in sound philosophy. So whether we have disagreements about application or something, those are modest compared to the profound agreements that we normally have. But I also
Absolutely.
appreciate the fact that you bring a different perspective and that you get us not to just be an echo chamber, but to actually have a meaningful discussion.
I love it. I can actually picture you while they're saying we have a comment from Jim here, and I can just picture you typing it like frantically.
Caps. I'm an intense guy.
You're
Uh,
awesome. You are a
Well, you know
prince
what, Ayn
among men,
Rand, you know
sir.
what, before I leave, the last thing I want to say, one thing I forever will be grateful for Ayn Rand for is she encouraged the development of my mind and my reason to be the best and most rational and logical self I can be. But she never, ever, ever took away my passion, this intensity. And the two have gone hand in hand. And thanks to Leonard, thanks to Ayn Rand, I've kept both a passion and an intellectual rigor and precision that I think actually properly go hand in hand. If I'm intense sometimes, it's because I care about ideas. But I admit it, I can be intense sometimes. All caps sometimes.
Jim, thank you so much for being here again. I look forward to having you on again and again and again for as long
My
as you'll be
pleasure,
with
my
us.
brother, my true brother. Thank you.
For now, this is Michael Liebowitz, the Rational Egoist, signing out. Remember, please like this episode, share this episode, and subscribe to the podcast. Till next time.